Hi, Dayo.
Hey, Reihan. Nice to be speaking with you again.
It's such a pleasure.
Yeah, I guess we should introduce ourselves, not to one another, but to everyone else. I'm Dayo Olopade. I'm DC correspondent for The Root. I'm a fellow at New America, and I also write for XX.
I'm Reihan Salam. I'm a fellow at New America. I'm a columnist for Forbes.com and The Daily Beast, and I blog for National Review.
Cool.
Dayo, you were recently in Turkey.
I was, which was great fun.
Tell us about your trip.
Really interesting. It is, of course, a really dynamic country. The stock sort of phrase that you would use about Turkey is that it sort of straddles east and west. It literally, encompasses Europe and Asia. The debate over whether it will join the European Union is, of course, a continually heated one. But the time I spent there was during a particularly interesting moment. We were in Istanbul and environs during the IMF World Bank meetings, which we saw none of. But we did see protesters, as you would expect for this kind of global event. And also, in the week leading up to the Armenian-Turkish rapprochement, which is, a conflict that's gone back to 1913, where, the Turkish then pre-government, I guess, it was still the Ottoman Empire, killed a bunch of Armenians. And it's a very sensitive issue, I found, when I was there. Obviously, since that moment, the Armenian government and the Turkish government have signed a sort of, a treaty of understanding that they're going to look into this. But people in Turkey were quite sensitive about using the word genocide to describe the mass killings that took place then. But it is, I think, part of what's a larger conversation about Turkey trying to, make nice with Western, the Western zeitgeist, for lack of a better word. And this includes, establishing itself as a real secular democracy despite having an enormous Muslim majority, being good on issues relating to the Middle East and the United States. Obviously, Iraq is something that they've been a key partner in. And I just was so interested in seeing the sort of age of the country was most interesting to me. How the U.S. is nothing older than 250, 300 years old. And there, you have people of all cultures and civilizations. It's very multicultural, just the way people look. And everything is about 1 million years old. So it was a very interesting trip.
So I'm curious. I mean, you've kind of identified a pretty broad set of issues that I think has certainly been true for a long time. I mean, we've debated Turkey's modernization in a lot of ways, the idea of Turkey as a secular state, and yet a lot of what we've seen more recently is the emergence of the AK Party, which is obviously built on the legacy of older Islamist movements, although this one has been strikingly different in that it's very urban. A lot of its base is kind of in Anatolia among the kind of lower middle class, but also among kind of the aspiring entrepreneurial class. And many have characterized the AK Party as a kind of Muslim version, a Muslim and distinctively Turkish version of Christian democracy.
Right.
And there's a great concern that the AK Party is. And there's great concern that the AK Party is challenging the kind of some would say rigidly secular basis of the Turkish state. And, as I understand it, I mean, the AK Party, because of its relative Europhilia and its desire to become part of the European Union, has actually pushed a variety of policies that had been rejected by some of its predecessor parties that, had rejected sort of Kemalism in this kind of forthright way, but also that it called for a tilt in the direction of the Muslim world. And the difference with the AK Party is that, on the death penalty, regarding relations with the PKK, they kind of have moved in this direction of taking a kind of somewhat softer stance, of trying to move in line with kind of European human rights norms. And yet now the prospect of the European Union maybe sort of not taking accession talks seriously may have yielded a backlash. I mean, let's sort of drill down a little bit about sort of what you saw as the kind of more salient things that may have concerned you or maybe that encouraged you.
Well, I think rigid is just the word to use when you talk about the commitment to secular democracy. That's something that was emphasized over and over again in conversations I had with, working journalists there, with, individuals who, we came across that worked in Turkey, academics. It is something that they're proud of in that, you're not allowed to wear a religious symbol of any kind, even in places where most of the women walk around veiled or with their hair covered in schools, in public institutions. You're not allowed to, express any religiosity. And so they're proud of his heritage. I don't know to what extent it's being tolerated within the sort of the political body of the country. But I do know that it is a move toward trying to attract a Europhiles, I think is the word that you used, Europhiles in the Turkish population and in the political life of the country, are seriously interested in reaching out to the EU, whether or not they're interested in having Turkey join. But I do think, Turkey, from what I saw, was sort of selling itself short vis-a-vis its relationship with the United States. Obviously, you have the southeastern part of the country being crucial to ongoing troop operations in Iraq. When the invasion was beginning, it was Turkey who, for a moment, looked as though it wasn't going to allow American naval ships to enter the sea space there and enter the country. But since 2003, I would say that Turkey has had a really good working relationship with the U.S., almost to a fault in that it was very pro-Bush, for generally speaking. Now I do think that Turkey has a certain amount of leverage regarding the United States. And yes, it is having to make concessions about, the Armenian genocide. It is having to beat down, I guess. I mean, that sort of seems like an aggressive word to use, but a lot of the specifically Islamist elements of its political life. But when it comes to something like Iran, which is, of course, a really important issue for the United States, but it's put a lot of diplomatic collateral out on that issue, Turkey has a robust trade in natural gas with Iran. Turkey also holds a seat on the UN Security Council this year, one of the rotating seats. And as such, it doesn't have a veto, but the issue of whether we're going to impose strict sanctions on Iran is something that deeply implicates Turkish interests. Now, they've expressed a desire to get along well with all of the neighboring countries. This includes Iran, not to mention Armenia as well. So I think the U.S. might find itself walking a pretty delicate line when it comes to diplomacy regarding Turkey. And we saw that President Obama spoke with President Gül sometime late last week about a number of issues, not Iran, in fact. I'm not sure that they didn't discuss it, but the White House didn't release any information about the ongoing conversation on that. But I just, my impression was that Turkey, could stand up for its interests. I don't know that they'll be able to pressure someone like Nicolas Sarkozy into accepting the idea of Turkish accession to the EU, but they do have some levers here that they can use to promote its own national interest, even if it checks against the United States.
Yeah, I mean, you raised a lot of different interesting issues there, and it's interesting. I mean, so with regard to the Turkish domestic political scene, one thing I find interesting is that, kind of early on, I certainly was very sympathetic to the AK Party, and I still think that I am, broadly speaking, insofar as, kind of they are this kind of modernizing force, and the fact that they, kind of are identified with kind of both the lower middle class and the kind of aspirational kind of entrepreneurial types, these industrialists in these kind of Western Anatolian cities, and the fact that they also attracted considerable support from the Kurdish population, and the idea that they kind of are calling for this relaxation of that rigid secularism in a way that doesn't endanger the idea of constitutional democracy. That all sounds very attractive, but of course, one thing that you've heard from a lot of voices that I consider pretty credible is that, initially the AK Party found itself in opposition with what some refer to as the deep state in Turkey, led by the military, which has kind of tended to have this kind of very powerful and very autonomous role in the Turkish state. And now there's some concern that the AK Party is itself developing a kind of parallel deep state. And, because of the AK Party's broad popularity, I think that, there's some anxiety among sort of folks who are opposed to, various aspects of the AK Party's agenda, that they are kind of amassing power and they're, in fact, entrenching themselves in power. And I can't really evaluate those claims, but it certainly seems like something that, kind of bears careful attention. And with regard to this, kind of the international relations piece of it. It's interesting because one thing that you've seen in the news most recently is this idea of kind of sharper tensions between Turkey and Israel.
Right.
One thing that I've always found really neat is that, kind of every now and again there's something that emerges from Turkish popular culture that becomes a kind of big international scandal. So a few years ago there's a movie starring Billy Zane as a kind of a mad American general who, kind of launched a kind of, crazy Iraqi freedom-style military attack on Turkey. And that goes to this kind of deep thing about Turkish foreign policy, this what some call Severus, I'm probably mispronouncing it, paranoia, but this idea dating from the First World War that the Western powers are bent on dismembering the Turkish state.
Right.
Ergo, so much of the truculent resistance to acknowledging the fact of the Armenian genocide, etc.
Right.
And also, kind of objecting to kind of human rights sort of critiques of Turkish policy.
And the Kurdish question, right. Yeah. Exactly. We're on the same page there. I mean, the Kurdish issue is really interesting. Yeah. I do think... Well, sorry, you should finish what you're saying.
Well, we also were talking about Iraq, and sort of I have a slightly different reading in that, when you're looking at what happened in 2003, I mean, perhaps there was kind of some softening, but I think that I certainly don't think that the AK Party was kind of slavishly pro-Bush, kind of after 2003.
There was still lingering
one thing that Americans,
positive sentiment towards Bush in the basic anecdotal conversations I had, which I thought was quite interesting.
Yeah. Well, but one thing that about 2003 that's kind of really important for Americans to keep in mind, and that I think a lot of people forgot at the time, is that after the first war, kind of the U.S. effort to kind of repel Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait, the Turks were very cooperative, and yet they were also promised a variety of things in the aftermath of that war. Because, of course, the Turkish economy, as you suggest, was kind of really heavily impacted by that war. And it actually was this kind of really punishing blow. And then all of those promises made by the United States vis-a-vis how we're going to get the international community to kind of offer kind of aid and sort of kind of various other measures that are going to... none of that happened. And so for obvious reasons, the Turks were very concerned about something similar happening. And now when you're looking at Iran, there's obviously a kind of anxiety that something similar is going to happen, this, kind of counter-narrative to this kind of, we want Turkey to be anchored in the West, we want Turkey to sort of tilt in the direction of Europe. This counter-narrative that also relates to what some would describe as the end of the Turco-Israeli Entente.
That's right.
Of, well, actually... kind of we ought to identify with suffering of the Palestinians, and also, kind of we have an interest in cultivating deeper relationships with other Muslim states.
Right.
And, Iran and Turkey are also both non-Arab states.
That's right.
In a kind of predominantly Arab region, and so have had kind of a relationship, for a long time. So, I mean, it seems like
something that I noticed, just in terms of the religious angle, it was interesting to me that the most, how should I say, expressive Muslim believers in certain more conservative parts of Turkey that we traveled to outside of Istanbul were Turks, but were migrants from predominantly Christian countries in Eastern Europe, where they were a persecuted minority transplanted to a predominantly Muslim country, and therefore were conservative in their manner and in their beliefs. But I do think, on the Israeli issue, it is, I wrote a piece back in April when Obama traveled to Ankara to speak to, in a preview of his Cairo speech to the Muslim world. And it was, only a few months after last December's Gaza offensive. And it was interesting to me that some of the experts I spoke to for that article did say that Turkey, you would rather have Turkey being the non-Arab Muslim, if secular, democratic critic of Israel than someone like Nasrallah or any of the other non-state actors who cheered or condemned Israel's actions during that conflict. And so it is, Turkey is sort of a preferable broker, and I think the U.S. is really, in its policy towards the Middle East, has emphasized that and sort of appreciates that reality. But, going forward, I do think that Turkish national interests might be something that, rather than being something that moves in tandem with the United States, could very well split. And I think Iran might be that point. We'll see what happens in the UN regarding Iran. But I don't know. I mean, I think Turkey might find itself in an interesting place where it is both pro-American and its own interest conflicts with that stance.
That's really fascinating. So what's the scuttlebutt that you were hearing about how Turkey might proceed, and sort of are they subject to a lot of pressure from the U.S. or they were subject
That's
to a
what
lot
I
of
don't
pressure
know.
from Iran?
That's what I don't know
exactly
because it was not released in the call, which was in the wake of some of the critique of Turkey for its stance toward Israel. Barack Obama and Abdullah Gül spoke to one another, but they did not speak. I mean, they supposedly talked about Afghanistan and Pakistan. They spoke about Israel, I think. They spoke about Iraq at length, but they did not speak about Iran, which it seems like kind of an omission given the sort of terrain that we've been discussing. So I don't know. I guess we'll have to wait and see. I thought it was an incredible experience. I had never spent time in a majority Muslim country, and so it was really interesting to see the mix of the sort of secular and the sacred, and the cosmopolitan, and the sort of bi-continental reality of this really old place. It was really a treat.
One thing I find it's interesting. I remember when the kind of idea of a kind of Turkish-Israeli accord started taking off, and it's interesting because so much of it had to do with Turkey's strategic interests in that because of human rights violations in the Kurdish regions, Turkey oftentimes was running into difficulty acquiring weapon systems from the United States, and so because of Israel's kind of large indigenous defense industry, I mean that was kind of one reason for the relationship. We were talking about how Turkey and Iran are two kind of non-Arab states in the region, and of course the same is true of Turkey and Israel. So many people believe that it might be a robust partnership, but one thing that's happened in recent years is that Turkey has achieved an entente with Syria. They have much friendlier relations, and also relations with Iraq are much friendlier than one would have expected, given Turkey's concerns about the autonomy of Iraq's northern region. So, I mean, I actually think that in the deeper question of Turkey's political future and whether or not it will be inside Europe or outside Europe, I mean, my suspicion is that it will actually be more outside. I kind of go back and forth.
Unfairly, I would say. I mean, the cultural issues are significant in terms of the stumbling blocks on the road to Turkish accession into the EU. I don't want to call it pure prejudice, but it is very interesting to me that the stopping and starting of the process has been, for the most part, European in origin. And, there are people who just call it racism. They just say, well, they don't like the way having an enormous, largely Muslim nation tacked on to the eastern borders of what is now Europe or the EU. They don't like the way that looks. And some of the more strong critics come from nations that have internally divisive politics vis-a-vis immigrant Muslims and the local population. But I do think I sense that you're right. I sense that these things, even in 2009, might still be intractable. And so we might see Turkey part of what is not Europe going forward in terms of geostrategy. But Turkey internally, is saying that every nation that rings our nation, we would like to establish good relations with. That's the sort of general line. And that's what's maybe motivated some of the Armenian stuff. And will complicate their relationship with Iran and Iraq and some of the other bordering nations that are deeply involved in U.S. foreign policy.
I guess in terms of my prescriptive views, I am not settled. I think that for a long time I believed, and this is broadly the belief of American policymakers of both political parties, that the United States would profit and the world would profit from Turkey being included in the European Union. And part of this is also a debate within the European Union between those who want a more federal, more centralized Europe and those who want a kind of looser European Union. And the idea of a Europe that would include Turkey would almost necessitate sort of kind of a Europe that is kind of far more decentralized, a multi-speed Europe, etc. And that's one reason why you have folks who moderate Eurosceptics in Britain, for example, who are friendly to the idea of including Turkey in at least some of the kind of.
Turkey is already having to submit itself to trade regulations within the European Union, but not getting any of the benefits. I mean, it seems a clear case, and the U.S. has been perpetually a very strong supporter, both during Bush and Obama's tenure. But maybe I mean, I don't know how closely you're an Afghanistan watcher. I have recently become obsessed with educating myself about the issue, and that has been really remarkable as an experience. Just because it seems.
I'm sorry, I don't. Just before we go into Afghanistan, because that's a subject I'd very much like to discuss, just a little bit more about Turkey and Europe. I think that actually, I really, really don't think that prejudice is kind of the main motivating factor. I certainly think that it's possible that it's one of a variety of motivating factors. But I think that when you consider that Turkey is a country, when you look at the accession of kind of the states in Central and Eastern Europe, the only one that was of any significant size was Poland. And so, that of course has bearing on the inner workings of the European Union, kind of the kind of representation. I mean, sort of, kind of like, who's going to get which seats in the European Commission, et cetera. And for a country that is quite a bit poorer than all but a small handful of the kind of states that have just sort of joined. There's also the matter of kind of development aid within Europe, and I think that Sarkozy, I mean, sort of one of his kind of issues when he was running for president was his kind of pretty ferocious opposition to Turkish accession, and you see that from political parties of the right, left, and center across Europe. And I think that it's interesting because in a way, if you're someone who believes that the European Union should not become a kind of ever closer union, should not become this kind of thicker kind of state, then it makes sense for you to support Turkish accession because, again, it's going to badly undermine sort of those workings because it sort of creates sort of this tremendous heterogeneity, not only in kind of any kind of ethnic or religious terms, but also in terms of levels of development, et cetera. That I think would necessitate some kind of clawback from, kind of the level of centralization that you have right now. So I actually, I don't think that this is about prejudice, and I think that there's a whole separate issue about Turkey's own interests. And of course, there are folks within Turkey who increasingly think that going in the direction of acceding to, various European demands in the name of joining the European Union is actually not the right strategy. And I think that actually one can imagine Turkey having a growth trajectory that is far more promising if they kind of orient their economy in this kind of different way, and if they tilt toward not only the Muslim
as being a pole within the Middle East as opposed to a sort of fringe outpost.
Totally. I mean, there's some people who talk about, when you're talking about Central Asia, this region sort of stretching to the Chinese border where you have kind of Turkic languages and sort of a potential zone of Turkish cultural influence. And beyond that, you have this kind of very dynamic economy and the prospect of becoming this kind of aid-dependent fringe of Europe rather than a country that actually tries to kind of strike on its own and actually try to...
And it's a very fierce sort of nationalistic thing that you get. And there's some, private grumbling about the little baby countries, your Latvias, your Estonias, actually being part of the EU. But, I completely hear the argument you're making. And I think that, again, the earlier point I was making about Turkish leverage vis-a-vis the UN, vis-a-vis Iran and Israel and Iraq, would be an interesting dynamic to check back on in, say, 20 or 30 years. If Turkey manages to have a sort of independent polarity within Central Asia and the Middle East and the sort of Near East, that would be really interesting to see. Because I do think that sort of the nationalism that I observed is not anathema to this project we're talking about. So... it may be that after, chasing after the carrot for so long that Turkey decides,
well, and also because, if you're talking about a Europe where populations are shrinking, and Turkey where, you do have an aging population, but the demographics are quite different from what you see elsewhere in Europe.
Well, people are leaving like crazy.
Well, where there's that, and also there's that anxiety too. I mean, because already you have like most of the states, sort of the earlier member states in the European Union have kind of placed migration controls on sort of the states that kind of have already joined in Central and Eastern Europe, and kind of just the idea of kind of Turkey sort of becoming part of the kind of common European labor market, and then also anxieties. And this goes back to your point about prejudice, but anxieties about the changing religious and demographic composition of some of the Western European states. It's just, I just think that it might be a bridge too far, and I think that the Turks who are cynical about European intentions, are kind of right to be, but they're also, I think that sort of pursuing this other project would be a really, really good idea.
Do you think that America's intentions in the region you discussed, stretching from, let's say, starting in central Turkey all the way to the Chinese border, do you think U.S. intentions are clear? I mean, I referred to Afghanistan and Pakistan as well as all of the countries that line that former Fertile Crescent. I'm not sure. I think there's been a lot of caution in official U.S. pronouncements, but some of it is really important, for these countries to take action.
I think that the United States, sort of vis-a-vis sort of what it thinks about kind of Turkey's influence, I don't think that there is. I think that, kind of the way that kind of we think about these issues, it just tends to be pretty narrow, and for the very good reason that if it's not narrow, it's impossible to reach any kind of consensus around it. There's this incredibly crazy book called The Next 100 Years by George Friedman, who's the Stratfor guy. He's this guy who produces kind of bizarro intelligence reports, private intelligence. And it's this book in which he predicts that Turkey is going to become one of the world's superpowers. I think it's a little zany, but it's actually really, really entertaining.
Used to be.
And and it's interesting because I think that, within Turkey, I mean, you have this incredibly paranoid political culture, this sense that actually the world is arrayed against them, and certainly, kind of this European resistance to Turkish accession doesn't help that. It certainly contributes to that paranoia. But that paranoia is just really, really deep, and it's also fascinating the way in which the Turks have always seen themselves as a kind of victim culture, despite the fact that, of course, the Ottomans were the kind of ruling ethnic group, within this.
But World War I was a big part of that, right? I mean, the Australian, British, Turkish battles in World War I were sort of like humiliating a little bit for the country in a sense. But the question I was asking earlier was a little bit broader than that. I mean, it sort of reminds me, the way the White House is behaving about this reminds me of Bush and stem cells from very early on.
Behaving about what? Like behaving about Afghanistan? Behaving about... Oh, yeah.
The discussion of Afghanistan specifically, and all sort of, chess moves relating to that. It seems as though they want... I mean, obviously they're thinking really carefully about it, but they also want it to seem like they're thinking really carefully about it. I was at a brief press availability with John Kerry, who had just come back from Kabul today, and he said that, after the elections, the new revote after, the allegations of fraud in the original election in August, only after that would the White House, in his opinion, should the White House make a decision about troop levels. And so it's not that they're kicking the can, but that there's this whole sort of, we're going to the war room, and then we're going to do it again, and then we're going to, meet with so-and-so, and Obama's going to sneak out in Copenhagen to meet with McChrystal on the plane. It's not unlike what, the theatrics surrounding George Bush in early 2001, or the summer of 2001, where he was deciding about stem cell research. Do you think that they're really torn, or do you think that it's sort of like, well, we better make this a good decision and make it look like we made one too?
I kind of have to assume that they are genuinely divided over what is, I think, a totally impossible set of decisions from their perspective. And
totally.
I also think that, there is some, I mean, you kind of hear this parroted by, kind of various allies of the administration and, among opinion journalists, et cetera, but this idea that, hey, kind of, why shouldn't we slow down? I mean, sort of, kind of what's the sort of, and I think that's kind of legitimate, and I think that, kind of one thing that, people remember is, during the run-up to the Iraq War, there's this idea that, oh, well, we can't wait, because then it's going to be winter time, and the troops, or it's going to be summer, and it's going to be too hot, and it's kind of like, and it was actually, like, kind of interesting, and I certainly found the argument credible at the time, but in hindsight, it just seems like, well, gee, I mean, it's actually funny the way that was the argument, kind of that conservatives made about the Iraq War. Now it's the argument that liberals make about health reform. Like, well, we can't wait because then you'll come up with various other reasons why it's a bad idea. So that's sort of unacceptable.
And just parenthetically, the healthcare thing, I'm fully in support of a bill passing, but the issue that really gets worse over time is the issue of climate change, which the administration has, shunted down the lily path. So that's just my parenthetical about this whole argument about, we have to do it now.
Yeah.
But I do think, look, it's a really, really, really unfortunate set of circumstances they confront. And Alex Rossmiller wrote this great piece for the New Republic recently about how the hyperventilatory tone of, like, we're in crisis, Afghanistan. I mean, because it's been 8 years, this October, I don't understand what the sudden, obviously it's a situation that's deteriorating, but it's not a word you can apply, it's not a situation to which you can apply the word crisis. And I think that's the argument Rossmiller lays out pretty convincingly, that it's something that we can sort of, be really stressed out about in our sort of, domestic political discussions, but that on the ground is more just at a slow boil than in some sort of, like, deep shock that we need to...
Yeah, I'm sure that Rossmiller knows much more about this issue than I do, but it just doesn't... I just don't buy it. I think that you kind of had a fraudulent election very recently. And I think that actually can accelerate some of the kind of, bad stuff that we're seeing, to put it crudely. And I think that, so, given that you have this kind of disputed election, and sort of hopefully now we will try to, repair some of the damage by having this runoff, and, or perhaps, now there's talk that actually maybe the country doesn't have enough time for a runoff, given the urgency of the situation, and so some kind of, and sort of, and, even 2 weeks, I mean, sort of, I think that level of urgency is actually totally legitimate, so, perhaps having some kind of power sharing arrangement, something to kind of enhance the legitimacy of this government. But, I mean, I do think that, so, for example, similarly, one could have said that after the terror attacks in Samara and Iraq, oh, well, what's the rush? But, well, yeah, but there are inflection points. You know what I mean? I mean, they don't happen every day. I mean, they happen every now and again. And I think that it's fair to say that a national election that, kind of is widely viewed as completely fraudulent could be an inflection point along the lines of the attack on the mosque in Samara. So.
Yes, that's right. But it seems like, I mean, Karzai really is like our man in Kabul. That's been the case. And it's sort of tough to sort of decide whether someone with whom you are comfortable, someone who's perfectly comfortable sort of navigating the world of Western elites, of the type that we send to talk to the brass in Afghanistan. I mean, I think that Hamid Karzai, and I've just been, I don't know if you've... Our mutual patron, Steve Cole, has written this absolutely great book. I'm sure you've read it, Ghost Wars. I am in the middle of reading it, and so I'm still sort of forming my opinion about all of these players who are now back in our lives, or maybe have always been. But Karzai is someone who, John Kerry went on effusively praising Karzai, not in a way that it was impolitic, but in a way that suggested that countries like the United States, in a situation where we're completely at sea, in a metaphorical sense, will gravitate towards the individual that makes us feel the most culturally comfortable, as opposed to the individual that has the most, locally endowed authority or expertise or popularity. And that is a story that permutes through Ghost Wars and is something that makes me sort of cautious about, perhaps power sharing, which the U.S. won't discuss until after the elections, if at all, might not be something that is more constructive for Afghanistan's political situation, which is what we're really trying to advance via security.
My reading is a little different. I think that the relationship with Karzai has deteriorated over the years for a variety of reasons, and part of it's kind of sort of.
Right, like his warlord drug.
There's certainly that, but also kind of leaving that aside, it's also just kind of like legitimate grievances about the kind of level of civilian casualties. So that, I mean, Karzai's, I think, political future depends on kind of distancing himself from the United States in various ways, and also Karzai himself is a paranoid guy. I keep talking about paranoia today, but who's only grown more paranoid. And I think that, it's a very complicated and difficult relationship for us to navigate. So I think that, kind of from my perspective, I think the thing is, well, what are the things that we can affect? For example, when you look at Maliki, he was considered an incredibly weak figure. And part of what happened is that the United States changed its behavior so we could change the dynamics so that actually Maliki could become a less kind of weak figure. And, there are trade-offs to that. I mean, on one level, it was a good thing in that it helped restore some of the integrity and strength and coherence of the Iraqi state. On the other hand, I mean, there's the danger of creating a strongman. Similarly here, Karzai has actually been severely weakened by the deterioration of the security situation. And so, in a sense, kind of were we to...
Right, which he's allowed in some ways to happen. I mean...
Yeah, yes. Sure. I mean, but he's going to... but also because of the kind of, fact that it's kind of, as far as he's concerned, this kind of objective fact that he can't have a huge amount of control over, which is that the kind of U.S. and its allies have kind of done an incredibly bad job of, kind of stabilizing the country. So I think that, it's interesting. I mean, it's actually, one of my favorite articles about this was Stephen Biddle's essay on Afghanistan and Should We Stay? And what I liked about it, first of all, I think that Biddle is one of the kind of most important foreign policy thinkers, in the United States. He had a huge effect on changing the policy in Iraq in a better, smarter, more constructive direction. And this piece, which he wrote for the American Interest, was extraordinary because it was so honest. And part of what he said is that, well, it's a close-run thing, and even if we do this, and it will involve sending a lot of troops, it actually might not work, and also the situation won't actually be dramatically, it won't be great, you know what I mean? But the alternative is, both options are really bad. This one option might be marginally less bad, and also we have an ability to affect the situation. One of the things that I like the most about Cull's Ghost Wars book is the way that it forces a kind of revised view of the Soviet presence in Afghanistan. And a lot of what Cole's been writing recently for his blog, The New Yorker, and also kind of in testimony to Congress, is this idea that the reason why we actually have this moment, and again, I think that he's a partisan of the urgency case, is that actually there's a precedent. I mean, the Soviets managed to create a kind of more or less workable counterinsurgency strategy in Afghanistan that could have led to some kind of decent kind of power sharing, some kind of decent government, had the United States been cooperative. But the United States refused to actually support the kind of the UN process after the collapse of the Soviet state. And, because of that, I mean, you kind of saw the state that could have survived totally crumble. And I think that one thing that he notes, which I think is quite extraordinary, some of the policymakers who were very key to making that decision, Robert Gates foremost among them, are now involved in making this decision.
Yeah.
And that could be part of the reason
absolutely.
why one gets the impression from news reports, and who knows if this is true or not, but that Gates, along with Secretary of State Clinton, is one of the voices who is pushing for a more forward-leaning policy, one that will involve sending sort of more troops, as opposed to the kind of Biden approach, which I kind of think is gaining momentum. So I kind of find that history is really, really valuable and really good for people to understand, because we have this kind of glib reading. Well, no one's ever succeeded in Afghanistan. The Soviets failed. We're going to fail too. Ergo, we should leave. And I think that misses a lot of important stuff.
Right, and obviously the Pakistani element of the equation is also really important, and what sort of signals. And again, Kerry said today that he's interested in seeing what kind of government emerges from the election, if it's executed properly, and if it can be certified as free and fair. Do you trust the individuals who then assume positions of authority in a new government, coalition or otherwise? That same question maybe hasn't been posed sufficiently vis-a-vis Pakistan for decades. Are these credible partners? A lot of the actual ghost wars that are discussed, involve a whole lot of just dissembling and misleading on the part of Pakistani intelligence services, and just U.S. not being focused appropriately or in a sustained fashion on the neighbor that is the most, relevant element of, that has always been a U.S. partner, and that, in the last, starting from midway through Musharraf's tenure, through what's now a sort of fraught relationship with Zardari, you just don't have a good. It doesn't seem like we don't know enough or trust these partners enough to enlist them in whatever we would decide to do, which makes it all the more sort of damning. Not to mention the money that's just sort of passing freely to the Pakistani government.
The case for increasing our presence in Afghanistan, I was going to say escalation, because it's interesting, because that's, of course, what the critics, that's how the critics characterize it. And
right,
the case coming from the right, which I'm sympathetic to, is increasingly really, really subtle, and thus it's actually difficult to kind of, use in political argument.
Unpack.
There was a big story in the Weekly Standard a couple of weeks back by Chris Brose and Dan Twining. Twining had worked for McCain in the past. Brose has just started working for McCain, had been a senior editor at Forum Health, the occasional blogging head. And his argument was that, the reason why we need to succeed in Afghanistan is actually to influence Pakistan's future. By defeating Pakistan's proxies in Afghanistan, we actually discredit a certain kind of approach within Pakistan. We discredit the kind of military's approach of kind of backing terrorist proxies, both in Afghanistan and also kind of vis-a-vis its conflict with India and Kashmir. And the thing is that the potent argument, and the argument that you saw President Obama made during the summer when he insisted that the war in Afghanistan was a war of necessity, not a war of choice, actually is this very different argument about Al-Qaeda. And it's this argument about how we need to prevent Afghanistan from once again becoming a safe haven for Al-Qaeda. And that's a kind of like a difficult thing to parse, because on one level, and Biddle makes this point very forcefully in his American Interest essay, the safe haven argument doesn't make sense insofar as Yemen is at greater risk of becoming a safe haven. Somalia, sort of a kind of whole sort of panoply of states. Right. And one thing that other folks have argued is that actually a lot of the terrorist plotting, has happened in Hamburg, has happened, kind of in otherwise kind of secure kind of states that we think of as allies. So I think that it's, but at the same time, like it's clear that the Taliban, has this, tight relationship with Al-Qaeda. And though Al-Qaeda, we've been severely degrading its leadership. I mean, that's one of the things that you've seen during the, last phase of the Bush administration and during this first phase of the Obama administration. There's been actually tremendous success, using, drone attacks, sort of, et cetera, or so we've been told, in killing Al-Qaeda's top leadership. And it's interesting. So, I guess the hope of the Bidens of the world is that these are separable questions. We can do one without sort of doing the other. So I think that, kind of the Taliban is definitely interrelated with the Al-Qaeda problem. But I think that when you're talking about the scale of resources that we would need to actually shape the bigger, much bigger and more consequential Pakistan problem, it's really hard to talk about. And I think it's really hard.
That's even more.
So, it's just, I kind of think that if people were very frank and direct with the American public about what's at stake, it's not clear to me that the American public would be like, that makes
sense. Nobody should do that. Right on. I disagree strongly. Nobody should ever, this is so bad and so anti-populist of me, but I just feel like people are like, wait a minute, we're still in this war, like, we're not really psyched about that, can we please leave? And you've seen a lot of, pretty facile commentary comparing this to Vietnam as a sort of at a 1-to-1 ratio and asking for a pullout immediately. I've seen public opinion polls that are like, we are just done with this. I would say leave the American people out of it, and I think it's
Are you saying this tongue-in-cheek, or are you serious? I'm curious. I can't totally tell.
I'm not sure that... the extent to which I'm still finding my footing on these issues is remarkable, considering the amount of time that I'm spending trying to educate myself. And I think people who don't like the idea of war and don't like the idea of the U.S. being involved and spending money on this might not have access to even the little bit of information that I'm finding myself having access to. And so... and I think I'm just saying the Obama administration shouldn't be looking at any polls about how people feel about Afghanistan and deciding what to do. I think that would be misguided. And I think it's something that they're not interested in doing.
This is fascinating to me. This is really fascinating. I'm...
What do people know about Afghanistan? I barely know anything about Afghanistan.
Similarly, I don't know, this is such a thorny set of issues, but also...
So we should. So 55% of the country wants us to get out, and that's about near Obama's approval rating. So
a large majority of Americans say they like the public option.
Even if we should bounce, that's not why.
I think a large majority of Americans say they like the public option, and I think that the public option is probably a.
Well, a lot of people in America don't even know what cap and trade refers to, as a sort of general. Is it the economy? Is it Wall Street? So. Wow, you just caught me out here sounding...
No, you're not, you're not a jerk. It's just interesting, I think that, it's interesting, I kind of am...
Oh, people do, use polls as bludgeons. I hope that the...
and we always, people use them opportunistically, et cetera. I guess my core belief is that I think that it is good to try to be very frank and honest with the public about the trade-offs that are involved in different policies. I think that no one really does it. I think that there are moments, there are brief moments when it does happen, and I think that those, sort of in my view, tend to be kind of salutary. But I think that, and this is kind of like the big conservative critique, or sort of, one of the many conservative critiques of the health reform legislation, that, kind of why not be upfront about the costs and then say that, kind of we need to make this trade-off and people ought to pay for it, you know what I mean? Rather than kind of obfuscate. And it's sort of course, kind of liberals have a different take on it. And then, I don't know, it's just, I guess, kind of, I just think that, kind of when you do try to make the trade-offs very clear, you'll often be pleasantly surprised, kind of folks who don't think the public is kind of sufficiently mature to make these decisions by how people react. On the other hand, I think that, you get in these kind of poisonous dynamics because, of course, you're always afraid of what the opposition is going to do. And I think that, the Obama White House has good reason to fear that if they really do commit themselves in this really big way to Afghanistan in a way that's, kind of opaque and that's kind of based on these kind of really Al-Qaeda heavy arguments, that, you could imagine the Republicans not being like, hey, actually we support the president 100%.
Oh.
You could imagine, kind of the Republicans saying, if the war continues to be really unpopular, we're going to get out of this unpopular war, sort of, et cetera. It's his war, kind of. And so, I think that they kind of feel, and this is what happened to LBJ, so that's why I think that the Afghanistan...
That would be really craven. That would be really craven, right? I hope that doesn't happen. Because if it's anyone's... Yeah. Obama did pick up the the thread where.
Well, no, but you could call it craven, but it's also like, and I think that it would be craven too, and I think that's why the reason why people like Bill Kristol are saying that kind of they support the president insofar as he supports Afghanistan, supports kind of a counterinsurgency strategy there. But I think that you could say that it's craven, but you could also say that, well, on the other hand, I mean, let's say you're on the other side and you believe that universal health care is really, really important, and you're kind of indifferent on this war stuff, and if you feel like you can get some political percentage by opposing an unpopular war, you're going to do it because the other side is deeply wrong. And similarly, if you're on the right and you believe that, kind of big government, the kind of Leviathan is a bad thing, and you were okay with it insofar as it was fighting the terrorists, and then 8 years on, maybe it's not, maybe it's something else that's just killing soldiers for no good reason. I mean, it's not craven, actually. It kind of makes sense. It fits in this broader narrative. I'm not saying that it's right or wrong, but I mean, I think that, I just think that it's one of these things where it's actually, I can totally imagine someone saying in a completely clear conscience, kind of making those kinds of attacks. And I think that, that's the struggle that, this White House and the last White House, kind of dealt with. And I think the thing about the last White House is that, kind of by 2006, 2007, you had a president who was like, I am deeply unpopular. I have the support of about a third of the country, and I basically can't let that affect my decisions, and I have to just kind of go, because he also didn't have other domestic objectives that he was trying to achieve in that last couple of years. Whereas you have a different president who has a lot of domestic objectives that, kind of are, deeply important to him, and that are very much at risk of a revolt, either from the left, or, kind of, are at risk if the midterm elections, kind of see this huge hemorrhaging of Democrats. So I think that, kind of it's this very different calculation.
Well, So on the one hand, there's the sort of interest in catering to healthcare versus Afghanistan is actually an interesting illumination of this particular dynamic. So the White House has promised to be super transparent and to sort of, put all this stuff on C-SPAN as it relates to healthcare, and hasn't really done that. I mean, I'm going to say that that's not a promise that's been fulfilled. At the same time, that it's something that I instinctively sort of applaud as it relates to making decisions about war and peace. The sort of the closed-fistedness. So I don't really know. I mean, I think that the power of the president's office is one that allows for a whole lot of secret-keeping. And that's something, maybe I'm thinking of this because I just had this, long interview with Cornel West where he, really, laid down for me, the way power dynamics work and, whether or not the president is going to be corrupted the way every president before him has been corrupted into, just the weight of sort of knowing, what he said, where the H-bomb is, and here's the key to the A-bomb, and, now that you're, in a position of authority, you can't help but not be accountable to people. I don't know what you make of that. I mean, it's essentially a reformulation of the idea that power corrupts. And it's jarring insofar as, the Obama promise, the whole campaign idea was on, back to power to the people, what have you, which I don't know is very American just in terms of the United States being a republic, lowercase. I don't know. I mean, what's your take on that? Do you think Obama's using his power constructively? Do you think he's withholding from people information they need to know, or is he being overly determinative in the way he does things? I don't know.
I found your interview with Cornel West really interesting. The bit of it that I know there's a second part that's coming out soon. I think that idea is really, really interesting. The idea that, just the kind of institutional prerogatives of the office lead to certain conclusions. So, for example, I think that there are a lot of folks who are very disappointed. Julian Sanchez at the Cato Institute has been writing brilliantly and forcefully about this, about the Patriot Act. About how you have a handful of liberal senators like Russell Feingold who are proposing serious revisions to the Patriot Act designed to curb some of its, what he saw as kind of excessive expansions of federal authority. And then the administration, which now includes a lot of folks who were pretty, sharp critics of the Patriot Act when they were out of power, actually was making the case that, no, we need, powers X, Y, and Z. And similarly, one thing that I found really interesting is the whole debate over the czars. President Obama's, kind of various, it's of course an informal title for folks who are coordinating policy.
The non-confirmed appointees.
And it's interesting
right.
because my friend Stephen Menashe wrote a great piece for the Weekly Standard in which he was defending the Obama administration and said that czars are a good thing because executive authority is a good thing, and that the legislature has a tendency to aggrandize itself, and that, given this kind of vast panoply of federal bureaucracies, and that, the president was supposed to be a unitary executive, the kind of term that was kind of deployed by Cheney and Co. in the old days. The idea that, that...
The old days.
So, it's just it's really interesting.
Sorry,
because,
let's call them the old
that,
days. I'm going
Menashe was saying that actually conservatives should be supporting Obama against his critics. And, it's interesting because, of course that's always true, right? Because, when conservatives believe that, they're more likely to kind of hold executive authority, they're inclined to expand executive authority when they believe that that's likely to be in the hands of the left. So, James Burnham, made attacks on the Imperial Congress, for example, when it seemed as though, the right was going to kind of hold executive authority. I think that just kind of goes back and forth. And, when you believe that, we're the good guys, and when we have the levers of power, we're going to use them well and use them wisely, I think that is totally inescapable.
Constructively, right. Yeah, I think there is some consistency to... It's too early. It's really too early to say with respect to this president, but there is a certain gleefulness with which, power, the acquisition of power produces in presidents. And I don't know. I think I'd have to think a little bit more about how I feel about, especially as it relates to Congress, using the power that you're constitutionally endowed with. A lot of people, on the left side of the spectrum, are just so frustrated with the way Congress, especially in the Senate, has conducted themselves during these healthcare deliberations. It's like, we literally have 60 votes, goes the argument. Why not do what LBJ did, which is go and say, you're not getting another, water pipe or new school or new statue in your district until you get in line, And they marvel at the fact that the Bush Congress, until 2006, was able to do all of this crazy stuff that was really illiberal in their mind, with just a slight majority. So I don't know. I'm maybe partisan enough to say that you do whatever works, and if someone wants to undo it later, let them railroad that through. But in terms of the executive branch, I do think, Julian's writing is his idea of executive power and the sort of the dangers of its overextension are completely valid.
It's interesting. One of the things Democrats are dealing with now, we have 60 senators, we can't accomplish as much as we'd like to, is of course relates to Democratic success. When you have this Big Ten party, you're going to have more dissension within that Big Ten party, and if the Republicans ever got to the point where they had 60 votes, I imagine there would be similarly high levels of dissension, despite the fact that they tend to be a little more Well, I think so, because I think that you were pointing out that you had these kind of very narrow majorities, and part of that's a function of the fact that for a long time the Republican Party has been more ideologically coherent, and there are definitely costs associated with that. One of the biggest costs associated with the high level of ideological or relative ideological coherence is that it means that you can only become so big a coalition. It's interesting because you also see this in discussing this kind of grand strategy, the idea of the minimum winning coalition. The minimum winning coalition means that you don't have to divide the spoils as much as you would in a larger coalition, and so status quo coalitions tend to be much bigger than revisionist coalitions, because status quo coalitions want to preserve the status quo, and so there are no spoils to be distributed. You're just basically happy with how things are. So that's one reason people argue that Franco and Falange Spain didn't join with the Axis powers, because there was no incentive for them to actually have another state with whom to share the spoils.
Yeah. Go ahead. I often wonder what the United States would be looked under a sort of parliamentary democracy system where, there were... I don't know if it would be something that's more stagnant, or whether, as a result of the kind of politics we practice that are very partisan, or whether it would be the complete opposite, and we would not have the sort of political log jams that we have today, because people would just have to get something done in coalition. So that's just a counterfactual that I find really interesting. But I'm curious as to what you make of this, only 20% of the country really identifying as Republicans, and within that I mean, this is separate polling, but, 48% of self-identified Republicans thinking that the president doesn't love America. I mean, that's like, you could insert any sort of crazy theory there and maybe get that same output. But do you feel like your thesis, in your book, and your own sort of willingness to engage folks who are ideologically different from you in ways that are constructive, and in ways that are in ways that are constructive prevails? I mean, do you think it's something that you're sort of out there on your own, or do you think that your party is, I don't know, completely more?
I definitely don't think that. I think that a lot of it has to do with the different incentives. I think that you're talking about incumbent legislators who are trying to get reelected, and you have a situation where their constituencies are likely to be in the midterms, in particular, old, and so I think that kind of frames the kind of issues that you talk about. I think that it's just natural. I mean, and also I think that, in my view, just saying no to health reform at this stage is actually the right and appropriate thing to do. And it's certainly true that, kind of you would want Republicans to have alternatives. I think that there are a variety of alternative proposals from Republican legislators that are actually pretty good. Not flawless, but pretty good. But I think that given that Republicans are not going to be driving this process, given that I sort of, even if you kind of had this kind of small handful, I mean, it's possible that if you had, for example, Chuck Grassley, if he weren't afraid of a conservative primary challenger, maybe he would have been more intimately involved with constructing the Obamacare legislation. Mm-hmm. It's not obvious to me that he could have actually made it much better without, huge defections among Democrats. So I just don't really, this idea that, if only they play ball, if only they sort of, go, I mean, I think that when you deeply disagree with the kind of basic premises that are at work, and, also, like, it's just amazing to me the kind of way that people talk about this stuff. Like, it just strikes me as, like, so completely tendentious, and with regard to, the CBO estimates, one thing that they are not allowed to do is they're not allowed to kind of divine, what are going to be the larger macroeconomic impacts. That is, so given that the pattern of subsidies will create implicit marginal tax rates, what effect will that have on work effort provided by sort of folks across different, households with different incomes? It's going to have a pretty big, pretty appreciable effect, but, we have no idea from the CBO numbers. So, like, we talk about this in this kind of total vacuum, and then we hear, well, we can't delay this. We can't study these things further because, of course, the Republicans only want to delay it so they can get their advocates and the health insurance lobby to destroy it. And it's just so weird. It goes back to, well, it's going to be summertime in Baghdad soon, and then it's going to be too hot for the troops to fight. So,
no, you know what, Reihan? I think that that's a completely credible argument. I really do. I mean, the as I said earlier, I mean, it's not. It's the Obama administration's legislative priority was to say we have a deadline and this is when we're going to do it and this is going to be the thing that I get done that no one else got done and blah, 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 blah. I do think that's not a reason in and of itself to pass health reform. Obviously, we disagree about whether it's important to provide health insurance for working families and individuals in America. But I do agree with your point that it's not urgent per se, and I'm going to get a lot of flack for that.
Oh, wow. I almost feel like you should. I actually, this is actually a very strange thing because I'm always very uncomfortable when people agree with me about certain things. And I kind of, the thing is that I can also see a case where it actually is extremely urgent and, kind of I totally get it. And the case where it is extremely urgent is, I believe, let's say, I don't believe this. I believe that it would be a good thing for, this particular variety of health reform to not pass. But I can imagine if I were a Democrat thinking, you know what, it's Republicans are evil, Democrats must win, and so that is why they have to be stopped, because if they're not, then actually we're going to get Guantanamo, we're going to get all these other terrible abuses. So actually, like, it's weird, because obviously that's not, how I look at the world, but I kind of feel like it makes sense, and I kind of feel comfortable kind of arguing with that view. But I think that, I don't know, that's kind of a strange thing to say. But I'm just kind of really freaked out because in general, I just think that we're like walking into all of these kind of crazy buzzsaws that we don't fully understand. But of course, on another level, like, we never know. Like, if you had tried to cost out the impact of Social Security, it never would have happened. And I think that, it was probably an okay thing to happen. But I'm just kind of babbling. So tell me, like, are there any other things? I mean, we're kind of going, we should probably wrap up soon, but is there...
Yeah, we've been talking for ages. There was one story that you sent along to me that I really wanted to talk about just because it's pretty cool. It's about white cities, right? And the idea that the most desirable places to live in America are the cities that are predominantly white, predominantly Northwestern, and what that means. I mean, it's not the same as suburban culture, where people drive to the suburbs and plant themselves there away from the fray, at least in America, the sort of thick, strange, often disruptive realities of multicultural, interclass relationships that happen in a city. People park themselves outside of them. This is still urban living, properly constituted. I mean, constituted in almost utopian fashion, but it's still all white. And we're talking about cities like Portland and Seattle, like Austin, and what that's about, and why do people really love living there? I just thought it was very provocative.
Or, more pointedly, it's non-black. I mean, I think that, some people objected to the article.
Yeah.
Well, kind of a lot of these cities have immigrant populations, they have large Asian populations, but I think that is a really, really big thing, and it relates to the way in which, this idea of people fleeing from diversity. This is kind of one of the kind of unspoken, things about the shape of American life right now. I mean, you've had this period of rapid demographic change, and yet you've also had this series of kind of reactions and counter-reactions to that demographic change, including large numbers of native-born whites leaving states that are immigrant magnets and moving to states that are less so, and then, kind of when that diversity ends up following them, that becoming something very unsettling. Or the fact that, when you have, neighborhoods, when you have school districts that are diverse, I mean, this kind of leads to kind of less engagement from parents. This leads to kind of more parents choosing to send their kids to independent schools. I mean, it's just incredible. And I think that it's this way in which exit, kind of allows you to kind of get off the hook. It allows you to kind of, I'm not a racist. I'm concerned by this level of disorder, I'm just going to go somewhere else. Or I can't imagine that, people who move to Portland because they love local produce and they kind of think the food scene is awesome. Like, they're not going because they don't, but they're also there's all this other stuff. There's this kind of disorder and there's this, these other things that cross anxiety.
Well, the question is whether it's subliminal, whether it's something explicit. I mean, is the reason why it feels so great to coast down the aisles of, let's bring it to the East Coast. Let's bring it to Washington, D.C., to coast down the aisles of a Charlottesville Target. Why is it so serene? Why are you so happy as you reach for the various material goods that surround you? It might not even be conscious that, because because you're surrounded by non-black people. I don't know. Further complicating the discussion is really the idea of agency, because there are plenty of places where people are fearful of diversity that are non-white as well. The question is whether or not you have the choice to pack up your things and move to a McMansion. If you're an El Salvadorian immigrant surrounded by people who are also from El Salvador, you don't necessarily have that social mobility. So I do think that whenever we have these conversations about white flight and homogenous neighborhoods, I do like to introduce the idea that there are people who spend their entire lives around black people only. And so it is the rare individuals who cross-pollinate.
Yeah.
But I do think it is something very sort of subliminal to go to what, in an American Prospect article my friend Ann sent over to me, I referred to as whitetopias. And I don't know.
Once referred to Upper Northwest Washington as Upper
Target anyway.
Which I thought was pretty funny.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I think that part of what the White Cities article was trying to do, I thought this was very clever, is highlight the ways in which certain cities that are seen as progressive utopias actually put in place policies that are similar in a way to the policies pursued by gated communities. And what he was trying to highlight, I mean, he was focusing on the racial angle, but in a way what he was really trying to do is make a point about the way that kind of anti-growth policies have this very uneven class impact. That they can create spaces that are very pleasant and comfortable for upper middle class people, but for people who are aspirational, it actually, makes things very difficult. So interestingly, the cities that have been huge spaces for black upward mobility are cities like Atlanta and Houston, cities that he cites, that are cities that are sprawling, that are cities that, kind of are definitely not kind of smart growth kind of cities. Exactly. They're like car culture cities. And yet they're also places where, kind of, so it's interesting. And it's like, and it kind of raises this question, wait a second. So could it be that these kind of red state metropolises that are these places where, kind of people have these kind of big homes and sort of, kind of you have this kind of like very different kind of mobility and you sort of, are actually much friendlier to the kind of aspirational classes. And if that's true, what does that say about the kind of right. What I think some would say, the kind of liberal pretension that our model of not only of kind of the way the city should be governed, but the way that society should be governed is really truly compatible with upward mobility. I think that that's actually this kind of really kind of powerful thing, and he did it by trying to be kind of quasi-PC. You know what I mean? Which was the clever part of it, though.
Yeah. DC is fascinating to me, honestly. I mean, it's a city that's 75% black, and it's whatever. There are quantities, let's just say that. However, I just think that I need to study, migration patterns in the U.S. in the 19th century more. Because I do think, I'm from Chicago, which is, the destination for the Great Migration. And, there's a reason that there aren't that many black people that have made it all the way to Northwest Washington when they were brought to America and North Carolina. If we just want to make it really crude. And so there is a reason why there are more black people in the South, why Texas has an enormous black population, in addition to immigrant populations from South and Central America. But maybe Chicago as an example of a place where it's pretty segregated, despite being extremely cosmopolitan, both among white and black and Latino and Eastern European communities. It's a place where the black middle class began. We're talking about Johnson companies, we're talking about Jet, we're talking about Ebony, we're talking about Barack Obama. You know what I'm saying? That is where the black middle class began and ended. And it was only, and it's a northern city, for better or worse. So maybe, not looking at the sort of the medium between your Atlantas and your Portlands gives some sense of how you can sort of carve out your own urban reality without being entirely.
This is a disaster because this is you've touched upon my favorite subject of all subjects, which is cities and race and
I know, and it's been an hour.
Thanks so much, Dayo. It's always such a pleasure to talk to you, and we need to just get together and just talk about cities and race at some point, because I actually think that
true story.
I kind of sense that I might be able to win you over to the dark side. I doubt it, but I think that I could try. I'm kind of tempted because I think that
I highly encourage you to try. I think we made a real sporting effort at talking foreign policy today, so really appreciate you mixing it up with me. We will get together soon. Enjoy the video, blogging heads.
Take care, guys.
More soon.
Talk to you soon.
Take care.